can justify more budgeting, office space, and new hires. This has been called mission creep, where certain departments focus on things that are outside of their purview. Like they talk about certain departments now focusing on environmental issues when it, as you sort of touched on in your example, well, you're not being paid to do that, but they do that because it justifies more funding, staffing, etc.
Yeah.
So any comments or?
It's just, again, what is the product here?
Yeah.
What are the key things that the people are trying to produce? Is the purpose of the organization of a university to provide an environment for people to teach? Are the teachers the customers? Are the students the customers? Are they buying information from there? Is that like a unique position? When it's to the world in general, what is the main purpose of it? Are the students the product of the universities? But if the students are the product, then the product can't pay the institution for a product. The product is the end product. What is, in general, at least what do you think? And it's more of a question, just a general question to everyone who's listening, is what would you say the product of a university is? What is the product of higher education? Like the end product, where it's like, okay, this is a thing that we can say, or we can compare and say, okay, this institution of higher learning is better because this product, the key product that they produce, is just comparatively better than any other institute of higher education. And it's a good question to kind of think of answering.
Well, for me, it's also a question of value, because being a food guy, I think like, oh, if I go to McDonald's, I'll spend like $8, but what do I get? Okay, cheap burgers and fries, versus I go to a nice restaurant, I may spend 100, 150, 200, whatever. But if it's solid food, well, it's worth the value. And I think what's recurring here, as I've just sort of touched on with the whole finance and the way the incentives are structured, I don't know too many people who are saying, "Oh, this was worth the $50,000 a year or whatever I paid to go here." I've seen very few, if any, people who have ever said that, and I think that bears worth questioning at least.
Yeah, and then that's a good example with the restaurant stuff, where there's some things where it's like, okay, I'm okay with delivery. Where it's kind of like, okay, if you get your Big Mac delivered, it's not really going to taste different. The experience of that meal is not going to be that much different than you actually go into the store. In fact, like the drive-through, the delivery might actually be better because you can have some silence and you have more selection over your environment to consume that same exact meal. But then you go to a Michelin star restaurant, there is the ambiance, there is the extra, there is this other experience where you can say, okay, there actually is a difference being served in a certain time, in this certain environment, in a certain lighting. And there's other aspects that you can say add, where if the food is just delivered to your home and it's dropped off, it's not necessarily the same. It's still the same actual literal food, but it's not the same. So now that's a question now you that comes into with somebody's Harvard. Like these Ivy League schools. If you're reading Shakespeare, is the book really that much different if you're in some campus in New England versus in some school in some small town in Alabama? I'm not quite sure how different the actual experience would be in that situation.
Well, because to bring it back to the restaurants thing again, it illustrates the Austrian principle of subjective value. Like I've sort of made this comparison. I have some friends who are really into cars, and I've said, even if I had a ton of money, it would be harder for me to justify getting like the nicest car, because in my mind, it's like, I don't know how those things differ. Like I know a Lamborghini is a nice car, a Ferrari is a nice car, but I can't tell you why does this car cost $250,000 or whatever it is. Whereas with them, it's kind of the reverse. If they go to these nice restaurants, they're going to say, okay, this is a nice meal, but it's kind of lost on me. Like I had a roommate who was like that. Like he told me he had a friend who I guess owned, at the time, it was the top restaurant in New Orleans, and I guess he actually paid for it. And he's like, it was a nice meal, but he's like, I felt like it was lost on me. Like I wouldn't go on my own and spend that money because I would feel like, why is this really worth it? So it comes down to what you value. But I think if you have enough knowledge in that certain area and you prefer it enough, you can sort of illustrate the differences. Like I know if I go to a 2 or 3 Michelin star restaurant, as you say, okay, I'm going to have all these staff, I'm going to have all these courses, everything's going to be explained to me. They're going to pair my wine, all that. So as I often say, it's not just a meal, it's an experience, but you're paying for all those details, all the quality of the food, all that craftsmanship, et cetera. So you can sort of calculate, why would this be worth more? But again, back to the college thing, is it really worth that much more? And I think they say later in the book, if you take economics 101 at Princeton or some lesser known school, it's pretty much the same material. Is it really worth paying more, or is it just the brand Princeton on your resume?
Yeah, because there is a difference. Maybe the example I was giving earlier is not quite the same because when we said the Michelin star restaurant versus McDonald's, like even a burger at a Michelin star restaurant will have different ingredients, fresher
if they have a
ingredients,
burger.
maybe like Wagyu beef. Yeah, if they have a burger or equivalent, let's say it's a burger, it's a burger. They have something like hamburger or something like that. And then, so let's say it was to say if it's Shakespeare in both places, the equivalent would be like, what if you took the literal exact Big Mac, but you plated it and served it in the environment of a Michelin star restaurant. Or you took that foie gras burger you're talking about, and then you plated that and served it just in a brown bag like you do at McDonald's. And would that actually change the actual content of the thing so much? So yeah,
well. There's also food that doesn't travel well, like foie gras. If it's made cold, it'll oxidize once you cut it, so you have to eat it pretty quickly. Yeah. Of course, if it gets too warm, it's gonna melt. If it's hot, if it's seared, it's like you want to eat it pretty soon, because if you were to heat it up again, foie sort of melts. It gets seared, but it also melts as you heat it more. So there's certain quality concerns as well there.
There's got to be some tests of that. It seems to be something that somebody would have done a test of, like have somebody be like, okay, this is a burger from McDonald's, and they give you that same burger, but they say it's from, or you go to another restaurant and they serve you the same food, and then they say this is. I think there was something when I was going through. I think almost everyone who spends enough time online on YouTube, in particular, will go through a Gordon Ramsay spiel where you just watch a bunch of his things, and I think he had one of those times where he did something like that, where he said it was either other people served his food and then he said it was him who made it, or it was some kind of thing where
it was a hotel episode where he wanted to convince the owner to change the menu, so he had the chef do things, and he said, "Oh, I came up with this," and the owner was like, "This is really good," but he was like, "No, actually, it was the chef who came up with them, not me." But he wanted the chef to try them, and then the owner was like, "Okay, maybe I sold him short a bit." Yeah.
That's the kind of thing you were talking about earlier with the perception, where people would choose the university and things like that because people employ people off of that credential, not necessarily even being able to actually spend the time to actually study and see, does this person actually know what I'm hiring them for? And yeah, that's part of why business fails so much.
It goes to your point in one of the earlier videos about campus reform, where you ask people, oh, Joe Biden said this. Do you think it's great? Oh, yeah. Oh, no, it was Trump who said that. Wait, what? And then there's the reverse. But again, it's that perception of it. They're not weighing the value of the thing objectively. They're just saying, I like the person or where it comes from. And it's like, that's where, again, value is subjective. It's their choice. But at some point you have to realize, okay, like we say, a McDonald's burger, just because you tell people it comes from a high place, does it really become better in quality? It's just the perception that it is.
The elephant in the room that we're lying to ourselves. Yeah.
So let's see here. So in short, administrators have an incentive to oversupply their services. They end up creating unnecessary jobs and hiring unnecessary staff, which others pay for. This causes universities to suffer from administrative bloat. In the past 40 years, colleges have increased their administrative and non-administrative teaching staff by 300% or more. In contrast, the total number of students grew about 50%, and the number of full-time faculty has increased about 50%. Yale spends about $60,000 a year on administration per student. On $60,000 per year on each student in terms of administrative costs. Wake Forest spends about $75,000 a year per student on administrative costs. So Ginsburg goes on to argue how the value of all these administrators is negligible, if any. Colleges got fined about 40 years ago with far fewer administrators. Why do we suddenly need them now? I would also add on to that, with technology now, you could streamline and automate a lot of this stuff. You could probably do less administration even. So this was interesting here. Colleges have a perverse incentives to raise costs. The U.S. News and World Report's annual Best Colleges is considered the best for measuring college rankings. But here's the thing: 10% of the score the college gets relies on how much money is spent per student. The more a college spends, the better it ranks. So, quick example, I brought it up before. The University of Chicago is ranked number 3. But if they were able to provide the same education and research but cut back administration costs to 0, their number would drop to 14. So a lot of their number comes from how much they're spending. And then if Yale If Yale, which is tied with Chicago, if they did the same thing, they dropped to number 11. In contrast, if the College of William and Mary, which is ranked 32, but provided the same quality at 50 times the current cost, they would rise to 27. So if there's the incentive to spend more money, they're going to spend it. But of course, they don't examine where does this go, or does it really produce the quality worth the cost. So, in short, a private firm can produce more output at a lower cost. If they can do that, they're more successful. In the university system, the colleges that produce the same output at a higher cost get a better ranking and are considered more successful. So, again, a restaurant, you want to have a food cost below a certain level. You want to have profit margins above a certain level. But universities, if you spend more money, you get better rankings. So, there's that incentive to spend more and to justify spending more. So, Ginsburg also talked about the increased regulations and the cost of complying with regulations. Colleges lobby for regulation to become better entrenched and to justify hiring more staff, which allows for bigger budgets. So this will get later into the section on rent seeking, but they want those regulations because it's a way of shutting out competitors. It's higher costs of complying with them. But again, because they're not funded directly, they can use this to justify more subsidies and other things. So it's a bit different from whereas if a private firm lobbies for regulation, it's because they can absorb the cost themselves. Like the example they bring up later is that Coca-Cola may push for higher water standards, but they can afford to hire a team of chemists, which to a multi-billion-dollar company is not much, but to a little mom and pop shop, it's going to put them out of business. Whereas with this, it's a similar thing, but because they're not being funded directly, as I say, they don't really care because they'll find ways to they'll either jack up tuition, then it'll guarantee bigger loans, or they'll push for subsidies or something. So that cost is forced on other people. Any thoughts?
There's always an aspect of this where, unfortunately, when we start talking about some of these things, as you mentioned, just already the disconnect. The government is paying, but they don't actually use the actual service. The schools are being paid, but then what was it they said? Okay, the government is paying, but they're not using the service. There was the schools, and then the students are utilizing it.
The students are using it, but not paying for it, and the faculty is not selling it directly.
Okay, and then the government is paying, but not actually consuming it.
Yeah, the taxpayers are paying for it,
that already knocks things off. Then just the nature of the state itself kind of mutates things.
Yeah.
So some of the things when we judge and we look at this, it's not. It's like something has been irradiated, and then we're seeing this creature come out from this effect, from this environment. That's not necessarily the market. So when people blame market forces, this isn't a healthy market to begin with.
No.
And I'm sure there's going to be different levels of when the things started changing. But I'm guessing part of this began post-war when the GI Bill came in and there was lots of money starting to be funded towards universities at large.
That's part of it. The other thing was, are you familiar with the Supreme Court case, Griggs versus Duke Power?
No, not necessarily.
That's a bit controversial, but it had to do with when IQs were considered discriminatory. So that was the Supreme Court case that banned employers from administering IQ tests or some version of it. Of course, the reason was because at the time, minorities on average weren't scoring as high, so it was seen as discriminatory. So it was then passed on to colleges that colleges have to sort out who are the best, the smartest, the hardest working, all that. So instead of having one of those aptitude tests, you had to get a degree, and that would sort of show, okay, you've been filtered out through all of this. But then, of course, what happened is more and more people were pushing to go to college. So then in turn, colleges, of course, started lowering their standards because they wanted more tuition money, all that. And then, of course, the whole thing with, well, not everyone can afford college. Let's guarantee student loans. Colleges, of course, jack up the price. And then all these other various factors we're talking about. And then that's why I have to remember the number, but college costs have risen a few 1,000% since the 70s. And they're making the point that imagine if food or something, I mean, obviously the cost of food has gone up proportionate if you factor in inflation, but if the cost of food went up a few 1,000%, there'd be a revolution, because that's typically when revolutions start. People can't afford to eat. But then you have to ask is why are people just sort of sitting there and saying, well, that's just how things are. Let's just take this. No, it's because of all these various incentives, and the colleges aren't going to do anything because they like the money. But at the same time, a lot of students and parents, they don't want to take the time and energy to fight this because they see it as either they can't win or it's not worth the time or some other form of rational ignorance that we talked about in the previous video.
Especially with the food, it's almost the complete inverse of it, where in universities, in the education system, you have the cost going up that 1,000%, but you look at the teacher to student ratio, if anything, it's dropped. If anything, now there's a lot more students to every teacher. Every person is supposed to be given a thing. Yet with food, it's the inverse, where prices are dropping, and there's the explosion of restaurants, explosions of just the different diversity that you can actually get your hands on. Like if you want to eat any meal from any country anywhere, it's available and it's there in many different forms. Even delivered directly to your home. Now that's another big burgeoning thing. They found ways like you don't have to come to the restaurant; we'll bring it to you. So, and that's a physical, actual thing that needs to take these ingredients from this place, be cooked at this location, be brought to you. You've gone now into places where there's a bigger industry with one of those guys where they deliver you like a food set up in a box, it's already chopped and everything. It's like just put it in the pan for this amount of time. Like it's gotten to that point. There's a revolution in many other industries, but education has just grown bigger and bigger and more just ineffective and it's really a bad situation.
Well, look.
Thank you for listening. This has been a clip from an actual longer recording that I'll try to leave a link to on the screen or somewhere around here where you're listening to this.
Presents. 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 Presents.
Peasants.
Okay.